When the door stayed empty, the fluorescent strip over the reception desk hummed like an accusation, and I could hear my own heartbeat living in the vents. I stood at the edge of my show in a repurposed mattress factory on Navigation Boulevard, East downtown Houston, the place everybody called the Loft at Crane Yard because it once shipped springs to oil rigs and now shipped ego dressed as art. The lights were those brutal industrial bulbs that turn paint into truth and truth into something you can't ignore. They made the canvases look like confessionals, and the concrete smelled faintly of old sweat and lemon oil the janitor used at 5 a.m. I knew every inch of that room because I'd lived inside its silence for 2 years, painting with turpentine and cheap coffee, scraping off mistakes at 3 in the morning until my hands read like maps of where I had been brave and where I had been small. Before the gutters of anticipation got clogged, I had 1,000 smaller memories that led here. Nights sleeping in the back of my Ford Transit because I couldn't afford a studio and an apartment at once. Afternoons teaching art to underfunded middle schoolers for $30 a class. Mornings unloading pallets at a pottery salvage in the ship channel for extra cash. I mix my own pigments from crushed oyster shell I found near Galveston and the soot of the barbecues my uncles swore by, because I liked the idea that my colors carried the same shoreline the family always avoided talking about. My work's title lived in my head for months like a benediction, unspoken. That phrase was the skeleton for every brushstroke, the things everyone knows and refuses to say aloud. I told myself tonight it would at last be seen by them, by my mother who called me persistent, as if that were a compliment, by my sister who texted support in ellipses and promises she never kept. In the last 48 hours before the opening, I tried to stop measuring the night in breathless minutes and failed. I hung the largest canvas in the center as if mounting a lighthouse, tightened the wires until the frame no longer shivered, and traced the edge with a hand that still smelled like turpentine even after 3 washes. I rehearsed what I'd say to strangers who asked about process and lineage, practiced the short story I give at openings so I wouldn't sound like the messy, terrified kid I still was behind the veneer. I ordered 12 loaves of bread from an old boulangerie down the street because gratitude tastes better with carbs, laid out wine like a shy host, and watched Ava and Noah, my cousins who had shown up to everything, rain or shine, carry in a folding table with their sleeves rolled up. Every 15 minutes my eyes slid to the door like a metronome, checking for headlights through the dusty transom, expecting to catch the face I wanted like a photograph finally developed. There was a small, insistent dread that lived under my tongue all evening, the kind that makes you check your phone for messages you do not want to see. I told myself to be cinematic, to let the crowd do the lifting and the absence do the clarifying. But the truth is I kept peeking because I had built a life on being seen, and not being seen had become the default. I imagine my mother's laugh carrying down the boardwalk that lead to the gallery, my sister's sensible heels clicking against concrete, my father's pockets heavy with some strange Houston brand of pride. I believed, perhaps naively, that artists are allowed one night where their people step into the light and stand in the back like an audience that finally applauds. I told myself that tonight would be the night their absence couldn't be explained away by traffic or schedules, because I'd cleared calendars, begged favors, reminded them like a person with a bad memory begs for directions. The door that would stay empty darted at the periphery of every conversation I had with strangers who nodded solemnly and thought they were being kind. And for a while, I was able to steady myself on the hum of the lights and the concrete smell and the soft scrape of a wine glass against the gallery table. Ava and Noah showed up like somebody had rung the bell on the part of me that didn't think I deserved to be seen, and they came early with the kind of energy that tastes like starchy collages and bad coffee. Ava wore a paint-splattered denim jacket she'd thrifted from a pop-up market on Polk, and she carried a cigar box full of cash she'd been stashing from weekend shifts at a flower stall. She handed it to me like it wasn't a gift but a down payment on belief. Noah arrived with a toolbox and a grin, having quit his barista gig to apprentice under a metalworker who taught him how to weld promises into sculptures. He walked the gallery as if he owned every square inch and tightened 2 loose screws so no canvas could sag into shame. They moved through the crowd like family backup singers, steady and present, and every small gesture they made stitched a clean seam across the part of me that thought the night would collapse into a rumor about who I was. Mr. Thompson was there standing with his hands behind his back, like a man keeping the posture of the person who taught you. He lingered by the painting titled Unspoken and traced the air near a corner as if he could read my curriculum vitae in the brushwork. He had been my high school art teacher when I was more graffiti than gallery boy, and he smelled like old chalk and teacher-loud aftershave. He told a gaggle of strangers that he had failed me twice and therefore felt like the only one who had watched me practice failure all the way into something like discipline. That became a sentence people repeated to each other and to me. He failed him twice, and look at that. It landed like a benediction and made my throat hot with gratitude. Old classmates drifted through the crowd, some wearing the same worn humility they always had, some wearing new pocketbook confidence that made me squint. A girl who had been the prom queen nodded like she remembered the kid who drew on their cafeteria napkins. A boy who used to slam lockers now ran a bespoke bicycle shop and bought a small mixed media piece because he said his daughter needed to see how brave art looks. A local journalist from the Chronicle or an online arts blog I only half remembered messaging interviewed me under the industrial lights, asking the predictable questions about process and influence, but then asked about lineage and absence in a way that cut through the PR version I had practiced. He pointed the mic at Mr. Thompson and Ava, and the room held its breath while the microphone collected versions of me like rain. There were handshakes that felt like currency and a few small sales that were less about money than about trust. A woman bought the third piece, saying she wanted to start a collection for truth, and an older couple bought a tiny diptych because the husband said it reminded him of the ocean they used to pretend to own in a little Gulf house. Each time someone offered money or congratulations, the ache in my sternum softened by a fraction. Every compliment landed like a small healing. Someone commented on the way I used oyster shell pigment, and they said it made the colors smell like home, and I almost cried in front of strangers who would later write about nascent authenticity. Those words were warm. They warmed me enough to stand taller between the canvases. But the door stayed an empty frame, and the back alley outside was a cold cut of night air that kept cutting me when I turned to look. I checked the transom like a nervous gambler, glancing every few minutes to the shadowed stretch of shipping pallets and garbage bins no one had bothered to sweep out on Navigation Boulevard. The doorway was not just a passage. It had become a stage for imagined arrivals I'd been rehearsing for years. My mother Karen in a red coat that would have clashed perfectly with the paint, my father Michael with his old watch that hung like a talisman, my sister Emily with a lipstick I could recognize a mile off, Jacob who always showed up late but showed up, and Caleb who owed me apologies and change and had never been able to separate the two. Their absence wasn't a single cut. It was a slow bleed I'd been feeling all my life whenever I invited them to witness anything I made. People kept coming over to tell me what they saw, and I answered them like a man diffusing something hot. I let them think the applause was enough. It wasn't enough because every generous word ricocheted back to the doorway, and a small part of me kept waiting for the silhouettes that didn't come through. In the midst of glasses clinking and a baritone laugh from someone who used to be my rival, I felt like a hostage who had negotiated his own release and was still waiting for a family member to unlock the car he had been left standing beside. Night folded over the warehouse, the industrial lights threw long shadows, and the smell of turpentine mixed with perfume and kalash crumbs until the ache tasted like a dish no one wanted to clean. I stepped outside for air at 9:12 p.m. because rooms start to pulse when you stare at them too long, and the gallery felt like a heart that had learned to skip. My phone buzzed in my pocket with that shy vibration I had taught myself to ignore most nights, but tonight my thumb answered before my mind did. Emily's Instagram story loaded in a glossy smear. Grill smoke curling up like it's trying to sign a name in the sky, Michael flipping burgers with the slow, careful rhythm of someone who thinks a spatula is a baton, country music bleeding from a cheap Bluetooth speaker. Red Solo cups clustered like a small constellation on a picnic table. There was a bowl of potato salad with a plastic spoon stuck in it like a flag, and a football spiraling through a backyard pass to a boy I didn't recognize at first. Until I saw the paper mask he was holding up, a childish cutout of my own face someone had stapled to a stick and pressed to his cheeks while he ran. They were laughing. They were doing family. There was no text, no call, no hint in any corner of the screen that they were thinking of me or even knew where I was that night. For a second the screen became a small, sharp thing inside my chest, a compass needle that refused to settle. The smoke in the video smelled like summer and neglect in the same breath, which made the smell of turpentine still clinging to my jacket feel obscene, as if I'd washed paint fumes into something that had no business mixing with backyard smoke. I didn't post a comment, I didn't send a message. I put the phone back in my pocket and stood outside the loading door where the alley smelled like dumpster metal and frying oil and late-night promise. I breathed like a man doing set changes, pull the curtain, strike the lights, don a new face, and walked back in because there were people asking about provenance and process and how I mixed the oyster shell pigment. I let the journalist finish the recording, answered about lineage and silence in the way I had practiced, and kept my hands steady when someone reached to shake them. Inside, the room kept doing what rooms do when people treat them like altars. It gave me back small truths. I sold 3 pieces that night, one to a woman who said she wanted to remember someone she used to be, another to a young lawyer who wrote a check and told me I was investing in myself, and a small diptych to a man who told me it reminded him of a dock he couldn't afford anymore. Ava and Noah folded chairs, boxed leftover croissants from the table, and laughed too loud when I finally let myself laugh, which was its own kind of repair. I packed labels with the same care I used when I was younger to tuck paintings under my arm as if they were sleeping children. I rewrapped a canvas that had a corner smudged by a visiting elbow and noticed, in the way artists notice terrible little things, that one brushstroke in the lower right had dried a fraction darker than I meant. It looked for a second like the shadow of someone standing on a fence. When the last guest left and the industrial light hummed down to an exhausted orange, I taped the final box shut and put the shop's keys in my pocket like they were small tests of responsibility I had to pass. The gallery smelled like turpentine and perfume and spilled wine, and when I opened the loading dock to pull the dolly out into the night, the alley swallowed the sound like a mouth that hadn't been used properly. I didn't send a voice note that said I saw, or why, or where were you. The text bubble that would have begged for apology sat unopened and looked stupid in my head. Instead, I washed my hands twice in the single bathroom sink because the smell of paint on skin kept making me feel like a forgery, and I let Ava wrap my shoulders with her thrifted denim jacket because she would not let me stand in the cold alone. I drove home slower than I needed to, the packing boxes clinking in the back like a small, accountable jury. The night had been a business success by some small metric. People called me honest and bold and necessary, and those words fit into my pockets like coins that would help me buy the next thing. But the backyard footage with the paper mask of my face would not leave me. It folded into the same place all the small nothings lived, birthday dinners missed, calls ignored, a lifetime of circling when no one opened the door. I slept with my phone face down on the nightstand and the video replaying in the part of my head that keeps its own quiet record, because sometimes the loudest betrayals are the ones that never even bother to ring. I was still taping the last crate shut when Olivia Reed found me by the loading dock, her boots leaving prints on the concrete like punctuation. The gallery had thinned, wine rings gone cold, a stack of labels by the desk, a crooked poster of a past show folded under a box, and the industrial lights made everything look more honest than I felt. Olivia came up behind me with a plain manila envelope and slid it across a crate as easily as someone passing a note in school. She didn't make a scene, her voice was low and raw-edged, the kind people use when they mean something will change lives. "Don't open it here," she whispered, and her laugh had something like a ledger closing in it. The envelope thumped on the wood like it had weight, not just paper, and I watched her retreat into the warehouse shadow like a conductor leaving the stage after the last note. I didn't open it right away because business needed my hands and not my curiosity. People were still asking about provenance, about the tiny oyster shell inclusion in a corner. Ava stacked chairs with the precision of a woman who'd made lists since she was 12, and Noah wheeled up the dolly humming off-key to some old radio in his head. Olivia lingered long enough to say what I would later understand was the point. She'd been showing the work to a private roster that usually waited 3 seasons to blink, and a couple of collectors, one in Miami, one in Basel, had asked to see the pieces in person before the week closed. There was a scrap of brass on her cuff, a half-smile like a down payment, and when she slid me her card it felt like catching a train I had only ever watched leave. The envelope stayed with me like a small animal as I locked the gallery, as I watched the lights dim, as we loaded August rain onto the backs of our trucks. At 1:17 a.m. I sat on the edge of my couch and scrolled the phone because my thumb does reflexive work when my brain is still folding. 71 missed calls filled the space by my name like a summons, an arc of yellow dots I couldn't bring myself to comb through at first. The log showed Karen, 44 calls between 9:20 p.m. and 11:33 p.m. Michael, 18 Emily, 5 Jacob, 2 Caleb, 2 every number stacked like a barcode of anxiety. The last one was 11:47 p.m. and all of them had gone to voicemail. I let them sit there. I didn't listen to a single message. Letting them be missed felt like the smallest act of self-preservation, a measured, quiet refusal to let panic rewrite what had already happened on the screen. A backyard, a paper mask, laughter without me. When I finally opened the envelope, it felt ceremonious in the lamplight, as if the paper had been waiting for me to be honest. Inside was a stapled, multi-page contract that smelled faintly of coffee and new ink, and beneath that a small handwritten note in black that tilted like a promise. "You're not just good, Ethan, you're the real thing, let's show them." The contract was real in the way heavy things are real, year-round representation, 2 solo shows guaranteed this coming year, press outreach with named journalists, access to private collectors, an advance that let me breathe for a while, and a clause I hadn't known to ask for. Final approval on licensing and use of my name and image. Olivia had a lawyer's habit of protecting the thing you are, as if she knew family can become a commodity. The pages wore the crease of careful thought, and the percentages and timelines looked less like math and more like permission. I signed without hesitation because hesitation felt like bargaining with the wrong thinking. My pen moved across the line like a hinge. There was no dramatic flourish, no vengeful note scribbled in the margin, just a clean stroke that felt like a lock closing. After I initialed the last page, I slid the contract back into the envelope and put it into the top drawer of my desk where I keep things that mark turning points. I texted no one and I called no one. Instead, I set a quiet boundary that wasn't a taunt but a truth. I would not be defined by the people who left the door empty. Signing that paper was a vote for my future self. It was not revenge. It was a choice to protect a name and invest in people who had already shown up, to turn my talent into capital for the ones who believed before anyone else did. The envelope sat heavy in the drawer like a secret full of light. And for the first time in a long time, I felt I was being seen by someone who knew how to keep what they saw safe. I didn't listen to a single voicemail that night because my silence felt like the only honest answer I had left. And honesty had already cost me enough patience to make a new rule. I walked the 3 blocks to my studio on the corner of Polk and a skinny canal where the mosquitoes know the names of people who work at night, and the city smelled like gutter rain and frying onions. My hands still smelled faintly of wine and turpentine, and when I unlocked the studio door at 2:03 a.m., I could feel the contract in my chest like a small, certain weight. I boiled a kettle, poured a cheap beer into an old saucepan because I needed something to wash off the shape of the night, and then I painted like someone trying to be a witness to themselves. The purge piece took 6 hours and one bad song on repeat, and it used things that had nothing to do with traditional honor. I mixed oystershell pigment with charcoal I swept from the edge of the alley where the barbecue coals should have been, folded a strip of a red Solo cup into varnish so the gloss looked like dried plastic laughter, and sewed a tiny paper mask, one that looked eerily like the one I saw in Emily's story, into the weave of the canvas so it poked like a memory. I dragged a ruler through wet paint to score a vertical line down the middle, then wiped away half as if erasing an answer. When it dried enough, I hung it on the studio wall backward, the painted face turned to the plaster, the raw primed back opened like the flat of a closed door. It looked like a statement you couldn't read unless you knew how to find the hinge. I called it closed door and signed the corner with the date and a little thumbprint in black. At 9:02 a.m., with the studio sun coming in like an audience, I photographed closed door for Instagram the only way I wanted it shown. Honest lighting, the edge of my hand in the frame, a coffee ring on the lower left corner. My caption was short and precise and took up space like evidence. I listed names and tagged them because names are how you build a public ledger. Ava Noah, Mr. Thompson, Janelle, my old barber who gave me free trims when money was thin, Marina from the print shop, the kids from the after-school program who painted a mural with me, the sommelier who donated wine, the couple who bought the diptych. I wrote thank you spelled out no flourish. I did not mention Karen, Michael, Emily, Jacob, or Caleb. I left them blank like a bracketed omission in a sentence that once had meaning. The post moved through timelines the way smoke moves through a room, slow then everywhere. Ava texted first. Heard from Karen, she's crying on the phone, call her. Noah sent a video of him at the flower stall, hands muddy, grinning like he'd placed a crown on something real. My cousins relayed messages like nervous relay runners. Someone from the Chronicle tagged me in a story that used one of my lines about turning absence into furniture, and suddenly folks I'd never met had opinions. A friend named Theo, who works the night shift at a diner and knows how I look when I'm trying not to cry, called me at 11:17 a.m. to say, Karen's been on the line all morning. She sounded like she finally noticed she hurt you. At noon, my phone dinged with an audio file from a family number, and I told myself I wouldn't listen until my hands were clean and no one else was in the room. When I pressed play, the transcript sat in my head like glass. Michael's voice came through shaky, deliberate, the kind of man who practiced being casual and never learned it well. Ethan, he said, we thought it was small. We figured you had more of these nights that we could make one later. We didn't mean to, and then a long breath like a man riffling through the pockets of his conscience. We thought it wouldn't matter, call us back. The message ended with a rustle and the distant hiss of a grill or maybe a TV in the next room. It had that ordinary timbre of people explaining themselves to the world as if explanation restores truth. I did not call back. I did not send a paragraph of apology or a rationalization that would have looked like bargaining in public. My restraint wasn't a punishment, it was a boundary I set with both hands. I would not be the man who validates absence with explanation. I would not translate their neglect into my labor. Instead, I texted Ava to say thank you again, told Noah I'd pick up flowers on Friday, and messaged Mr. Thompson to ask whether he'd be willing to be on a panel Olivia wanted to set up. I kept my voice small and businesslike because what I was building needed clean edges. The post was not an accusation, it was a document. It said in black letters and tagged handles who stood with me when the door stayed empty. That public record felt less like revenge, and more like clearing the table so the people who cooked for you can sit down. They came back like weather fronts, one after another, carrying neat ideas and loud expectations as if absence were a pause button and not a hole. Emily texted at 10:14 a.m. with a PDF attached called Carter & Co. MOCKUP, pastel logo Photoshop storefront on a suburban strip and a spreadsheet that read like a wish list. Branding, pop-up merch, family legacy. She wrote in the message, "We can get you into community centers and influencers. Think bigger merch prints, a permanent spot at the farmer's market." Jacob sent messages full of logistics. "Hey bro, need a painting for collateral on a little loan. Can you front me a signature for my bio?" Michael called and left a long, warm-sounding voicemail that read like a pitch and not a question. "We could make this Carter," he said. "Turn the name into something that pays. 10 to 15,000 to get started, seed money. We'll handle operations." Those words felt practiced, like a man who had rehearsed generosity until it sounded like an offer. They dressed the ask in family language: legacy, honor, don't throw away your roots. But the mocked-up storefront and business plan smelled like someone trying to monetize me without having been part of the work. The PDF had a mock-up of a coffee cup with my signature slashed across it and a line that read, "Authentic Carter Goods." There was a section for licensing my face on tote bags with a projected ROI and a note in a tiny font saying they'd split everything evenly. When Jacob asked for a signature to speed up papers, I felt my skin tighten because signatures are legal anchors, not favors to be borrowed. I forwarded the file and the messages to Olivia without commentary at 2:07 p.m. because she had become the only person who talked to my art like it was a thing that needed stewardship rather than a family heirloom to be pawned. Olivia's reply came 5 hours later with the efficiency of someone who'd seen this movie before. She attached a lawyer's letter that read plain and cold. Any use of Ethan Carter's name, image, or work without express licensing and written consent would trigger immediate legal action. The email had an additional paragraph laying out the mechanisms: licensing agreements, royalties, cease and desist templates, and a phone number for a lawyer who smelled like old books and quiet authority. Olivia wrote in the body, "Protect the thing that makes you money and sense, don't give your name away." There was a bluntness in her tone that felt like a map being handed to me, and suddenly the contract she'd given me weeks ago wasn't just a paper full of promises, but armor I could wear when my family tried to treat me like a storefront instead of the owner. The family escalated in the way families do when their ambitions meet a closed door. Furious voice memos piled up on my phone, group texts filled with guilt-edged ultimatums. At 8:03 p.m., a group chat lit up with a single melodramatic line: "If Ethan wants to live like a stranger, let's treat him like one." And then the thread filled with thumbs-up emojis and versions of righteous hurt from cousins who'd been silent for years. Emily phoned late and tried to fold shame into apology, then slid into proposals between syllables. "Can't you just let us use a few images? It'll help us, it's family." Jacob left a voicemail that sounded like a man angry with his own wants. "You always make this difficult, man. We could all get ahead." Their messages wanted access, and most of them wanted to pay for it by leaning on a past that never paid me back. I read all of it in the small hours and felt a neat clarity settle, like snow that lets you see footpaths. They were asking for short-term gain on the currency of my name. They wanted entry without witnesses to all the nights that built that entry. I responded once to the group text with a single sentence that was more legal than personal: "Do not use my name or image without written licensing. Olivia's team will handle inquiries." I didn't add punctuation to savage or soften. I kept it flat because I refused to stage drama. The lawyer Olivia recommended sent the first cease and desist draft 3 days later, terse and professional, no threats that read like revenge, only the clear posture of someone who would enforce the right to control your own identity. When guilt turned into frantic money requests, I declined with the same calm voice I used when someone asked about pigment sources at openings. I offered no loans, no signatures for collateral, and no backdoor deals. Instead, I redirected the conversation. I promised of a small grant to help with the flower stall, offered Noah access to a welding commission through Olivia's network, and set up a microfund for the after-school kids with a local nonprofit. My refusal to finance the boutique or to let my likeness become a coffee sleeve wasn't cruelty. It was the point at which I protected the work that had allowed me to keep breathing. Holding that line cost me people's approval and bought me something else: a clear border between who I would be for money and who I would be for love. The momentum surprised me the way a train surprises you when you thought you were standing far from the tracks. One week I was mailing small prints from my kitchen. The next collectors from Florida and Seattle were asking for provenance, and the curator at a museum in Austin wanted to see Unspoken in person. Flights multiplied, Newark at dawn smelling like jet fuel and stale pretzels, Tegel at midnight where I watched city lights run like spilled paint, and a gray morning in Paris where the rain made my canvases look like old maps. Reviews arrived with a sort of disbelief that felt like recognition. A feature titled "Silence So Loud It Echoes" landed on a Sunday morning and I read it twice in bed, the words a soft proof that the work had reached someone who heard. Olivia negotiated shows in New York, Berlin, and Paris with the calm of someone who'd moved chess pieces my whole life. And suddenly, the schedules on my phone looked like invitations instead of threats. I decided early I wouldn't spend this on one big thing for me. I would spend it on the people who had shown up when the door stayed empty. I wired money to Ava at 9:42 a.m. on a Monday and watched the transfer ping her phone. The amount alone paid off her stall's back rent and bought a small walk-in cooler so she could expand her flower co-op. Noah's transfer went through at 10:11 a.m. and the grin in his video later proved it was the right call. He bought a proper welding table and leased a corner of an old train shed to build a shared metal studio, offering apprenticeships to kids who'd only known fast food kitchens. I didn't frame the gifts as charity. I called them investments in lives that had invested in mine. They were deliberate payments with permanent effects, down payments and equipment, not one-off dinners or the sorts of things that evaporate. Mr. Thompson got more than a framed print hung in the hallway of his long-lived classroom. I chose a limited archival print of Unspoken, matted and framed with a brass plaque that read, "For seeing what was there." I signed it in the corner, and we staged a small morning at Kennedy High where students lined the hall and my old teacher pretended to choke when I handed him the frame. I also set up the Thompson Emerging Artists Grant, an annual $3,000 award for a promising student, administered through the school and funded in perpetuity by a small trust Olivia helped me establish. I sat on panels, ran free weekend workshops, and offered paid mentorships with weekly stipends so young creatives could afford to show up without working into the night. The grant and the workshops felt like institutional memory being rewritten to include people who usually come last. With Olivia, I launched a limited edition print series that became a small business experiment in fairness. We produced 200 prints on handmade paper infused with oyster shell pigment, each print stamped with a certificate of authenticity and a tiny sewn fragment of a paper mask embedded in the margin, an ugly little truth sewn into beauty, so the work carried its story. Instead of paying everyone with promises, Olivia structured an equity model. Ava, Noah, Janelle, my barber, and Marina, the print shop owner, each received a 3% profit share and a named credit on every print edition, plus lifetime royalties. The prints sold through Olivia's collectors list and an art tech marketplace in Berlin that reached a new generation of buyers. The revenue stream meant my supporters had something that could keep paying them long after the exhibition lights went down. It was radical in its neatness, people who had carried me carrying something back. I built small systems rather than gestures that would go cold. I started a microfund for creative apprentices, a residency of 4 weeks in my studio that paid room and board and offered exhibition opportunities at the Loft, and a mentorship circle that met every other Tuesday for honest critique and paid stipends. I brought in a bookkeeper and an old college friend who knew about nonprofit setup, and we made the processes ironclad: applications, panels, transparent accounting. When I could, I sent checks with notes that said nothing more than "thank you and here is your margin from something you helped build." The gestures were grateful and practical. They were intended to last, not to be Instagram moments that could be liked and forgotten. People said it was revenge in the tone of the people who like tidy stories. I refused that narrative. What I wanted was not an eye for an eye, but a rewriting of who got to profit from my work and who got to steward it. I had the lawyer Olivia recommended, the contract in the drawer, and a small circle of named collaborators who now had real equity and a voice in how my name was used. I slept better most nights, and when I walked into the studio now, the space felt like a workshop of people who had chosen each other, not like a stage where I begged for permission. The career accelerated, yes, but the point of the speed was to create room to protect names, to fund young hands, and to make the generosity that once felt like a plea into something deliberate and lasting. We held Unspoken in a dry arroyo outside Santa Fe under an old cottonwood that looked like a hand someone had left planted there long ago, and I invited only the people who had shown up when the door had stayed empty. No press, No Instagram premieres, no clinking champagne from people who counted the night by likes. Olivia arranged the logistics like a private army, truck beds turned into benches, a generator humming soft as breath, and string lights looped from limb to limb so the desert evening would read like a theater without a marquee. The air smelled of juniper, dust, and a faint trace of oil from the crates we'd used to ship the prints. It felt wholly in the practical way of things that are built by hands. Ava and Noah came early and unrolled a pattern of blankets. Mr. Thompson arrived in a shirt he'd patched years ago, like a man literally stitched to his past students. Janelle the barber cut an extra crew of hair in the back of a van so nobody had to look like they'd just run in from nowhere, and Marina from the print shop brought a cooler of tamales as her kind of offering. A couple of collectors drove from Santa Monica and Basel, but they parked and sat quiet because Olivia had asked them to be witnesses, not the audience. The bounded guest list made the evening feel like something being recorded in a ledger, names written down for memory and accountability. We kept the centerpiece under a tarp until the moment I wanted it seen. The tarp smelled like canvas and the glue of new crates. It rustled when people shifted the way clothes do when someone is about to speak. When we pulled it back, the painting stood larger than I had expected, taller than any of the frames I'd hung in cramped studios and galleries. It reconstructed the backyard barbecue exactly, folding chairs sagging into old grass, a grill with its lid propped like a small mountain, red Solo cups in a scatter that read like punctuation, a plastic bowl of potato salad with a crooked spoon, a football half buried in the dirt. I had painted that scene from memory and from the little video on Emily's story, but I had also painted space into it. One place at the table held only the negative shadow of a body, the air there painted with oyster shell pigment thin as breath. And then in the lower right, behind the fence line I had ached to render, I left something faint and almost accidental, a small child's shadow, a ghost of a boy watching through a split in the fence. He was half there, half suggestion, like a photograph undeveloped. The paper mask I had sewn into a previous canvas found its echo here in the way the boy's face was implied and not explicit. People tilted their heads toward it, the way you do when you try to hear a voice past a wall. A soft intake of breath moved through the crowd like wind. No one clapped. No one spoke. There were torsos pressed into jackets, hands finding other hands, and a sound that was almost a sob caught from the back of a throat. Olivia stood near the painting and watched faces instead of camera lenses. I watched them more than they watched me, Ava's mouth open like she'd swallowed a prayer, Noah's jaw slack with the kind of surprised grief that looks like respect, Mr. Thompson wiping his eyes with the heels of his hands because he is the kind of man who keeps his pride folded for others. Collectors shifted in leather seats and made notes the way people do when they want to remember a fact. One of them reached out and touched the frame, then drew his hand back as if the image might scald. The hush felt like a verdict that didn't need argument. The painting did what I had wanted it to do. It told the whole backyard story quickly and without flourish, and people found themselves inside it like guilty extras. We left words out of the evening by design, no speeches, no long reckonings, no theatrical takedowns. The point was not to browbeat anyone into remorse, but to make a place where the truth sat visible, and the people who had been loyal could see the exact thing they had supported. After a long time of silence, the guest book made its rustle audible on the table. People wrote small things, dates, lines, messy signatures, and then toward the bottom of a page, a short, uncredited line caught my eye like a small stone in a clear river. For the boy who saw everything, I'm sorry I didn't. The handwriting was not neat. The sentence was not signed. It landed in my chest the way an apology might if it were honest and not performative. I walked out toward the road after the lights had been taken down and the last tamales gone cold, and I saw him. Michael, shoulders rounded under a jacket that smelled faintly of smoke and old soap, walking away down a dim dirt lane with a small boy at his side. They moved like people who had rehearsed regret into a shape, awkward, halting reel. The boy clutched a paper mask in one fist and looked up now and then at the man beside him. I stood there and did nothing because I had already chosen. I had already turned my work into armor and given my money to the people who had held my coat while I learned to stand. I will not pretend that the note or the sight of them made everything whole. The ending stayed ambiguous the way life is. A man walking away, a child at his elbow, a painting heavy with evidence, and a guest book that recorded one small, plain apology. I left Santa Fe with my hands full of the names of people who had shown up for me, legal contracts, equity shares, grants that won't evaporate, and with a strange, steady relief. I had reclaimed my narrative by choosing loyalty over blood and by investing my life in the hands that helped me build it. The last image I took with me was not a victory banner but a wintered kind of grace. The boy's shadow in the fence, the apology written without signature, and the quiet knowledge that showing up is the thing that makes a family, not the fact of sharing a last name.